It was late again. Too late. I leaned against the doorway to Dylan's room, arms crossed, watching the dim glow of his tablet reflect off his face. His fingers moved across the screen with the precision of someone who had long forgotten the world outside of it. His laptop was open beside him, some unfinished project blinking in the pale light. "Dylan," I called softly. No response. I stepped closer. "Dylan, it's almost 3. You need to sleep." He exhaled sharply but didn't look up. "Just 5 more minutes, Mom." It was never just 5. It was always an hour. Then 2. I sighed and moved into the room, pressing my fingers lightly against the back of his neck. He tensed for a second but didn't pull away. "You're burning up," I murmured. "When's the last time you ate?" "Had a sandwich earlier," he muttered. "Earlier when?" He shrugged. His body told me everything his words didn't. Dark circles, slouched posture, the faint tremble in his hands. "You're overworking yourself again," I said, my voice softer now. "You can't just live off caffeine and adrenaline." He finally looked at me then, his blue eyes heavy with exhaustion. "I know," he admitted, "but there's just so much to do. This new client—" "Can wait until morning," I interrupted. "Come on. I'll make you something to eat." Then bed. Non-negotiable. For a moment, he hesitated, his stubbornness rising to the surface. But then his shoulders sagged and he nodded. "All right," he said, shutting the laptop. 5 minutes. I smiled. Small victories. The kitchen was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator. I moved with practiced ease, grabbing bread, eggs, and butter. Dylan slumped onto a stool at the counter, rubbing his eyes. "You don't have to do this, you know." I cracked an egg into the pan. "And yet, here I am." A ghost of a smile played at his lips. "You always take care of me." "Of course I do," I said, flipping the eggs. "I'm your mother." "You don't have to, though." "I mean," he hesitated, "I'm not a kid anymore." I turned to look at him, spatula in hand. His face was leaner now, sharper. The soft edges of childhood had long since disappeared. But to me, he would always be that boy who clung to my hand at the grocery store, who fell asleep on my shoulder after long car rides. "I know," I said quietly, "but some habits are hard to break." He didn't respond right away, just watched me as I slid the eggs onto a plate and set it in front of him. He picked up his fork but didn't eat. Instead, he said, "Why don't you sleep?" The question caught me off guard. "What?" "You're always up late, too. Always in the garage or the studio." He met my eyes. "Do you ever stop?" I huffed a small laugh, sitting across from him. "I could ask you the same thing." He smirked, but there was something thoughtful behind it. "Maybe we're more alike than I realized." "Maybe," I admitted. The conversation settled into something quieter after that. Dylan ate, and I watched the clock, thinking about the morning classes I had to teach, the routines I still had to choreograph. The world never seemed to pause for people like us. And maybe, deep down, neither of us wanted it to. The bass pulsed through my bones, vibrating in my chest, in my fingertips. I moved with it, letting the rhythm dictate my body, my breath, my heartbeat. This was my space, my time, where I shed everything else and let movement consume me. The studio in my garage wasn't much, just polished wood floors, a wall of mirrors, and a single pole in the corner for when I choreographed routines for my students. But here, I wasn't a mother, a teacher, or a woman juggling responsibilities. I was just Fiona. I twisted into a slow body roll, arms above my head, feeling the heat build in my muscles. My hair clung to my damp skin. I was lost in the movement, in the music, until something shifted in the air. A presence. I turned sharply, my breath hitching, my body locking in place. Dylan was sitting on the beanbag chair against the far wall, watching me. A shock ran through me, sharp and electric. My stomach dropped. I hadn't even heard him come in. He must have seen the look on my face because he held up his hands. "Sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to scare you." I reached for the remote and cut the music abruptly, the silence deafening. My pulse roared in my ears. "What are you doing here?" My voice came out too sharp, too tight. Dylan leaned back, relaxed, but his gaze stayed on me. "I was heading to the kitchen to make tea," he said, his voice calm. "Walked past, heard the music, and I saw you." I swallowed hard. I was suddenly aware of everything. How little I was wearing. Just a sports bra and dance shorts, sweat glistening on my skin, the rise and fall of my chest. Dylan had seen me dance before, of course, just not like this. Not in my element. Not when I thought I was alone. I turned away, wiping my face with a towel, trying to compose myself. But inside, something was twisting, shifting. A feeling I didn't want to name. "You dance beautifully," Dylan said. My stomach clenched. I forced a chuckle, keeping my back to him as I grabbed my water bottle. "You've seen me dance a million times." "Not like that." His words sent a shiver up my spine. I turned slightly, meeting his gaze. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. Not in a bad way. In a way that made my skin prickle, my breath catch. I needed to shake this. "Well," I said, forcing a light tone, "you better not be planning to gossip to your friends that your mom dances around in the garage like a lunatic." Dylan smirked. "Not a lunatic," he said. "It was mesmerizing." I took a long sip of water to cover my reaction. This was ridiculous. I was being ridiculous. Dylan was my son. My baby. He was just making an observation. That's all. But the way he was looking at me, I didn't know how to respond. So I turned back to the mirror, my reflection pale and tense. "You should go to bed," I said, forcing normalcy into my voice. "It's late." There was a pause. Then the soft sound of the beanbag shifting. "Yeah," Dylan said. "Good night, Mom." "Good night," I murmured. The door closed behind him, but I didn't move. I stood there, staring at my own reflection, my chest rising and falling too fast. My skin still tingled. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, watching me, those blue eyes locked onto me like he was seeing me for the first time. It was ridiculous. I was making something out of nothing. But then why did my stomach twist every time I thought about it? Why did I feel exposed? I rolled onto my side, gripping the sheets. The house was silent. Dylan's room was just down the hall, his door closed. For 19 years, I had been his mother. I had kissed scraped knees, packed lunches, reminded him to brush his teeth. I had been everything he needed, and tonight shouldn't have been any different. Except it was, and I didn't know why. The next morning, I kept myself busy. I scrubbed the kitchen counters harder than necessary, arranged the shoes by the door, reorganized the fridge, anything to distract myself. Dylan came downstairs around noon, stretching his arms, his hair a mess. "You're up early," he said, grabbing a yogurt from the fridge. "I always am," I replied, keeping my back to him. He leaned against the counter. "You okay?" I hesitated for half a second before forcing a smile. "Yeah, just thinking about my next class routine." Dylan studied me, like he knew I was lying. I needed to break the moment. "You should come to the studio sometime," I said suddenly. "Get out of your laptop for once. It's not just for girls, you know. Pole dance is an amazing workout." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "You want me to dance?" I shrugged, smirking. "Afraid you won't keep up?" His lips curved into a slow grin. Challenge accepted. I laughed, the tension lifting just slightly. But as I turned back to the sink, rinsing my hands, I felt his gaze linger on me a moment longer than usual. And my stomach twisted all over again. Dylan didn't mention the night in the garage again. But I felt it lingering in the air between us, like the last note of a song that never fully fades. I told myself it was nothing. I was overthinking, projecting, making something out of a moment that meant nothing. And yet, everything felt different. At breakfast, when Dylan reached past me for the coffee pot, I felt his body heat, the way his arm brushed against mine. It was such a small thing, nothing unusual, but I was too aware of it of him. In the evenings, when we sat in the living room, watching a show together, I noticed how close we sat. How his knee would press against mine, how he would stretch and drape his arm along the back of the couch, his fingers a breath away from my shoulder. It was the same as always. And yet it wasn't. I told myself to ignore it. But ignoring something doesn't make it go away. One afternoon, Dylan actually followed through on his promise. I was between classes at the studio when he walked in, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, a smirk on his lips. I raised an eyebrow. "You're actually here." "You challenged me," he said, shrugging. "Figured I'd see what all the hype is about." I folded my arms. "All right, smart guy. Let's see what you've got." I didn't expect him to take it seriously. But as I went through the warm-up, Dylan copied my movements with surprising focus. He was a little stiff at first, but his coordination was good. His body had the kind of strength that could adapt quickly to new movements. Not bad, I admitted. He grinned. You sound surprised. I rolled my eyes. Okay, let's see how you handle the pole. Dylan hesitated. You do realize how weird this looks, right? I laughed. It's a workout, Dylan. Strength, balance, control. Nothing weird about it. He exhaled and stepped forward. Fine. Show me. I moved to the pole effortlessly, gripping it with one hand, twisting my body into a fluid spin. It was second nature to me, muscle memory, so deeply ingrained that I didn't have to think. Dylan was watching me closely. I could feel his eyes on me, following the way my body moved, the way my legs extended, the way my muscles flexed and released. Something in his expression changed. I felt it. I landed lightly, meeting his gaze. For a second, we just stood there, a strange silence stretching between us. Then Dylan blinked and smirked. Okay, that was cool. I cleared my throat. Your turn. He hesitated before stepping up, mimicking my grip. When he tried to spin, his body jerked awkwardly and he stumbled. I laughed. You need to engage your core. Dylan huffed. You make it look easy. I stepped closer. Here. I didn't think. I placed my hands on his sides, feeling the warmth of his body under the thin fabric of his shirt. Engage here, I murmured, pressing lightly against his stomach. Tighten your abs. Control the movement. His breath hitched, just barely. I felt it more than heard it. For a split second, we were too close. I felt the solidness of him under my hands, the way his body reacted to my touch. My fingers twitched against his skin before I pulled back quickly, stepping away. Try again, I said, my voice too even. Dylan exhaled, nodded, and this time he got it right. Something shifted after that. Dylan started spending more time with me, sitting in the studio after my classes, watching me as I worked through routines. At night, we talked more. He would sit on the kitchen counter while I made tea, telling me about his projects, the clients that frustrated him, the endless expectations of being self-employed. You never stop, do you? I mused one night, stirring honey into my cup. He smirked. Says the woman who spends hours dancing in the garage. I smiled but didn't argue. He had a point. Do you ever regret it? Dylan asked suddenly. I frowned. Regret what? Not doing something else. Something bigger. I hesitated, setting my cup down. I love what I do, Dylan. I know, he said, studying me. But I mean, don't you ever wonder what life would be like if you'd chosen something else? I thought about that. About the opportunities I'd let go, the things I'd sacrificed. The way I had poured everything into being a mother, into building a life for Dylan. Maybe, I admitted. But if I had chosen differently, I wouldn't have you. Dylan's expression softened. You don't have to take care of me anymore, he said quietly. I smiled. I know. But that was a lie. Because some habits are impossible to break. One evening, Dylan fell asleep on the couch. He had been working too much again, and I had lectured him about it, reminding him to take breaks, to rest. He just rolled his eyes but eventually dozed off, his laptop open on his lap. I sighed, closing it carefully and setting it aside. As I stood, I hesitated. He looked peaceful. His face was softer in sleep, the sharp angles of his jaw relaxed. He had always been a beautiful boy, but now he was a man, tall, strong, confident. Something warm and unfamiliar coiled in my stomach. I reached out without thinking, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Dylan stirred. His eyes fluttered open, sleepy and focused. Then he looked at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us felt thick, charged. I was too close, too aware. Dylan's lips parted slightly like he was about to say something, but he didn't. And then, just as quickly, I pulled away. Go to bed, I murmured, turning before he could see the flush on my face. Dylan didn't argue. But as I walked upstairs, my pulse was still racing. And I didn't know why. I told myself I was imagining it. The tension, the closeness, the way Dylan looked at me sometimes, like he was seeing me in a way he never had before. I told myself it was just because he was growing up, that I was mistaking familiarity for something else. that we had always been close, and I was simply overthinking things. But if that were true, why did my stomach tighten every time he touched me? Why did I feel the heat of his gaze even when I wasn't looking at him? I thought of that night when he woke up on the couch, the way our eyes met in the dim light, how I had reached for him without thinking. How, for a moment, it had felt like something was about to happen. And then I had run from it. But running doesn't change anything. It was late when Dylan showed up at the studio again. I had just finished a class and was alone, stretching, when the door creaked open. I turned, expecting one of my students to have forgotten something, but it was Dylan. "You're here late," I said, my pulse quickening. He leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, watching me. "So are you." I let out a breath, trying to steady myself. "I was just finishing up." Dylan walked inside, closing the door behind him. "Show me something new." I hesitated. "What?" "A new move," he said, stepping closer. "Something harder than last time." I swallowed. The last time we had danced together, his body had been too close, my hands had lingered too long. And now, with the door closed and the studio empty, the air between us felt heavier. Still I nodded. "All right," I said. "Follow me." I stepped toward the pole, gripping it firmly. "Watch how I place my feet. The trick is momentum. Use your body weight to carry you." I demonstrated, moving into a spin, my body wrapping around the metal, muscles engaging as I lifted myself. When I landed lightly, Dylan was still watching me. His jaw was tight, his blue eyes darker than usual. "Your turn," I said, my voice quieter now. Dylan stepped forward. He tried the movement, but it was clumsy, too stiff. He landed wrong, his balance off. I smiled a little. "Here." I moved behind him, placing my hands on his waist, guiding his movements. "Engage your core," I murmured, my fingers pressing lightly against his stomach. "Relax your shoulders." He tensed slightly at my touch, but then exhaled, adjusting his grip. "Good," I said softly. He tried again, this time smoother, his body more controlled. "Better," I said. I let my hands drop, but Dylan caught my wrist before I could pull away. I stilled. My breath hitched. He turned to face me, his fingers still around my wrist, his eyes searching mine. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. The air felt thick, charged, like something inevitable was about to happen. And then, he kissed me. It was soft, hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if I would push him away. But I didn't. I couldn't, because the moment his lips touched mine, my whole body reacted. Heat flooded my chest, my skin burning where his hands touched me. My breath caught, my fingers tightening against his shirt. It was wrong. And yet, I kissed him back. For just a second, I let it happen. For just a second, I let myself feel it. But then reality crashed down, and I pulled away, breathless, my heart pounding. "Dylan," I whispered. He didn't let go of me. "You felt it too," he said, his voice low, almost pleading. I shook my head, stepping back, breaking his hold. "No, this can't happen." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Why not?" I stared at him, my chest rising and falling too fast. "Because," I said, voice shaking, "I'm your mother." Silence. A heavy, unbearable silence. And then, more softly, Dylan said, "You don't feel like my mother right now. We've both felt it since that moment in the garage, haven't we? Maybe sometimes you have to give in to your emotions and let go of what you can no longer hide." I was in shock. I knew it wouldn't be easy, my son and I. This is a difficult path that we still decided to choose for ourselves. At first I was uncomfortable. Later, reality showed that nothing could be easier or better.